Right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Supernatural YA panel. This has been organised by Walker Books in coordination with lots of other publishers for the YALC at Home festival that's happening this weekend. So I'm super excited to be chairing this panel with two amazing authors, Kat Ellis and Deirdre Sullivan. So just a few points to note. This is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. If you would like to ask any questions, there's a Q&A button where you can type in questions to ask at we'll answer at the end. You can ask those at any time rather than using the chat bar, use that bar. And if you're watching it later, obviously that's only available during the Zoom call. So if you're on YouTube, you won't be able to ask any questions. All of our books are available to buy or pre-order. There are links in the chat, or if you're on YouTube, in the description. So we're going to do 45 minutes of questions, and then we'll come over to audience questions. So you'll have lots of time to ask questions that you would like to discuss about supernatural stuff. So to start with, I thought we could all introduce ourselves and our latest books. So Kat, would you like to start?
I would love to. I'm Kat Ellis, and I happen to have a copy here. This is Harrow, my newest book, which came out on the 9th of July. And it's the story of Lola, who is the daughter of a famous horror film director. And she ends up going to Harrow, which was the town where his most scary film was set, and finds herself caught up in lots of mystery and scary shenanigans.
And it's really good. I just finished reading it and it was so creepy and really lovely. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Deirdre, and I also just finished Harrow, and it's incredible. I couldn't put it down. It's like a really good horror movie. But I write witchy YA. This is my most recent book, Perfectly Preventable Deaths, which is about a town with a history of missing girls being found there, and two sisters who move there and kind of discover things about themselves. Some things they don't really want to discover, but sure, that's life. Yeah.
And I don't have a copy of my book to wave out around because it's not out yet. It's not out until September, but I usually write science fiction, and my next book is a supernatural paranormal thriller called The Reckless Afterlife of Harriet Stoker. So it's the first time I've written about anything kind of magical, and it's about a girl who goes exploring an abandoned building to take photographs for her university coursework, and immediately falls and dies and becomes a ghost. And she finds out that this abandoned building is full of the ghosts who've all died over many centuries, and they've been there for so long they form like an intricate society of ghosts. And she starts getting involved in trying to become the most powerful ghost, and inevitably it becomes a disaster. So it's about her reckless afterlife there. So we all write kind of paranormal, supernatural stuff. I wondered like how you first got involved in that genre, and what are some of your favorite books or movies that you remember really enjoying with that that inspired you to write it yourself. Kat, would you like to start?
Sure. I think, well, this is my fourth book, and it's the first time I've really kind of delved into more of the horror end of the thriller spectrum. I think all of my books tend to be thrillery with slight, dipping into other genres. I've always liked things that are a little bit macabre and scary and spooky, so it was natural, I think, for me to sort of build that into my books. But with Harrow in particular, I've always been such a massive horror film fan from the time that, I grew up just flicking through my dad's VHS collection of the big 80s and 90s horror films like Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween and all of those. I was watching these when I was about 8, just sneaking through his video collection and just absolutely devouring them. And that's never really gone away. So I think I get a lot of inspiration from the visual. So it was natural, I think, for me to write a book about horror films.
It does feel like a homage to like all the best like vintage horror. It's really great. You can always picture it in your head. It's got such a visual vibe to it. And you've clearly got some bookshelves full of some amazing books behind you. Are there any particular books that you really loved, or recent ones as well as classics?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like the last few months I read Teeth in the Mist by Dawn Curtis, which is an amazing Gothic horror set in 3 different time periods, but takes place in the Welsh mountains, so obviously close to my heart. But that was an amazing spooky book. As well, this year I read Mel Salisbury's Hold Back the Tide, which is just brilliant horror that I would describe it as being like The Village meets The Descent. You have this sort of isolated setting and very spooky things are going on, but you don't necessarily know what they are until suddenly they pounce. So yeah, those are some real good ones that I've read recently. And I'm looking forward to reading Good Girls Die First by Catherine Foxfield, which I've been hearing a lot of people saying fantastic things about, and I have my copy on the shelf behind me ready to read.
Deirdre, what about you?
I am A Perfectly Preventable Death is my 6th book, and it's kind of my first one that's gone full on horror. But I've really been drawn to horror as a reader since I was since I was very young, and I've ghostwritten some horror books for younger readers kind of earlier on in my career. I think it's a really nice, it's a really safe way to be scared, because you have autonomy over a book. Like, you can close a book, you can't close like A Man Following You Home. If only you could. But writers I really like Edith Wharton's ghost stories. I really like Edith Nesbit, who wrote like the Railway Children's ghost stories. And I think there's a seam of kind of women who have used horror fiction and Gothic fiction to kind of explore things that they couldn't explore directly in their kind of more contemporary work. And I really like that. And just like any story with a ghost in it, I'll adore. I like Dawn Curtis as well. I finished reading a book called The Return by Rachel Harrison recently, and I thought it was really, really good. It's about a hotel break and kind of female friendship and like power dynamics, but it's so kind of it's so atmospheric and so kind of just sensory. Like, you can kind of it's all saturated with color, and you can like smell the rotting wallpaper on the walls. Like, it's really, really immersive. It was great. And I loved writing Perfectly Preventable Deaths, and I kind of worked on it. I was working on it for about 7 years and 18 drafts. So it took up a big chunk of my life. But because if you are kind of, people can be sniffy about genre fiction, but like, if you want to build a world, you have to get it right and you have to put the work in, so yeah, it's
really hard to scare someone.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about all of my favorite kind of horror or supernatural books, they all were American, and I noticed that quite a lot of the ones that you said were also American. And I wondered, do you think that it's something that you don't really see in British fiction, is kind of this creepy horror vibe, or do you think that there's that is a new space that could be explored more?
I think that it is I think it's actually been around for a long time, but I think it's kind of one of the things that interests me is the stories that don't get amplified and the writers that don't get heard. And I know there's some really good publishers in Ireland at the moment called, one is Tramp Press and another one is called Swan River Press. And they've explicitly made an effort to reclaim kind of voices that haven't been heard. So for example, there's a really wonderful ghost story writer called Dorothy McArdle, and Tramp Press has republished 2 of her books. So I think kind of that it might not necessarily be that those stories aren't around, it's that those stories aren't being, and I mean, we get it time and again with fiction, what gets reviewed, what gets covered, whose voice gets amplified. And I think kind of it's probably there, it's just worth digging a little deeper.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, it tends to come back in waves, trends, I mean, it was such a big thing in the 90s, and I remember a lot of the books aimed at YA at that time, like Point Horror, Christopher Pike, things like that. I mean, they were so huge, and things just sort of fall out of favour after a while, but they tend to come back around, and I think maybe that's what we're seeing now is horror getting a big resurgence again. You know, I'm hoping it'll stick around for a good long time, obviously.
Yes, me too. So some of my favourites that I wanted to mention. So I actually named Harriet Stoker in the book after the film Stoker. Have any of you seen that? So it came out in 2013, and it's like this very creepy horror about this girl whose uncle comes out of a mental asylum and comes home and unravels this mystery within the family. And it's so creepy that I had to name my character after the family. Shirley Jackson, I also really love. The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle just like blew my mind when I first read them. And House of Leaves, which is this kind of massive book with loads of footnotes and very intricate history of ghost story within a ghost story within a ghost story all the way through, about finding a hidden door in your house and exploring it and finding a caving system, is brilliant. So I've always been a massive fan of supernatural and kind of subtly creepy in a way that you can't really work out what's wrong, but you know that something's not quite right. So I really wanted to write something like that. So have you ever experienced anything supernatural in real life, or are all your inspirations purely fictional? Kat, I know you have an amazing Instagram series of going and exploring like abandoned places in Wales.
Yes. I will say that I go looking for these experiences, but I can't say that I've ever found anything that I can categorically say, yeah, that was supernatural. The closest I think I've ever come was I went on a ghost hunt, and it was to a castle near here called Bottlewythen Castle. And they do these sort of organised ghost hunts where they have all the equipment and you get sent off into groups with your dowsing rods and things like that. You know, go and measure the drafts behind the curtains and things. So we were there, and they had two separate groups. So I was in the group that was downstairs, and there was one that was upstairs in a completely different part of the building. And next to the room we were in was a very grand staircase. And they turned off all the lights, you know, because ghosts don't like to come out when the lights are on. So we were there waiting in the dark, you know, listening to things. And all of a sudden we heard somebody running down the stairs. So we were like, oh, somebody's running down the stairs with all the lights off, you know, waiting for the crash at the bottom where they were, you know, must have fallen or something. But no, it was just footsteps running down the stairs and nobody appeared. We were expecting them to, you know, appear in the doorway. So the group leader that we were with, they checked on the radios, you know, is somebody from the other group come to join ours? And they're like, no, we're all here. And there was nobody else in the building. So we just heard, you know, this running down the stairs. And that's the only thing that has ever sort of made me think, maybe.
I think that would terrify me. I've never seen any ghosts, and I definitely am too much of a scaredy cat to want to. I would never go out and search for that. Deirdre, what about you?
I've never seen a ghost. But like I kind of like we'd have a tradition of kind of creepy stories in our family, and like things that, you know, kind of are told as if they really happened. So for example, this is like a story my grandmother used to tell about kind of her mother during the Spanish flu pandemic. So there was a woman in the village and her child was sick. So she went to the local kind of wise woman and asked that her child would get better. And she said, you know, kind of, I can make him better, but the next red-headed woman you walk past will die in his place. So walking home, she ran into her sister and her sister died.
Wow.
Just cute little family stories like that. You know how it is. So I think there's definitely an interest in the supernatural, and like you don't rule it out. I had one prophetic dream, which sounds really, really exciting, but it was about the most mundane thing. So I was looking for this. It's so embarrassing. I was looking for this direct-to-DVD sequel to the film The Crow. At one point, and you know the way you just get a bee in your bonnet about something and you're like, I want to find it. So I was hunting over all these video shops looking for it. And one night I had a dream and it was like, you will find it in Blockbuster. And the next day I went to Blockbuster and it was there on the shelf. And that's like the only time I've ever predicted something while I was asleep. And it's like, it's such a nothing. Like, you'd think I'd at least get like a shipwreck, you know?
Amazing. I think you need to write a novel just about that. The next question I wanted to ask was, which of us do you think would fare best staying overnight in a haunted house? Which, Kat, you clearly have prior experience at that, so you have a bit of an advantage. But Deirdre, do you think you would be able to handle it? Do you think you'd be good at, like, if there's something happened, at surviving to morning?
I would if I wasn't by myself. Because I feel like with other people, I'm kind of able to like click into, no, it's fine. I've got this. We'll be okay. You know, I'm just going to handle it. But like, I'm just a ball of jelly when I'm by myself, you know, kind of. I'm like, I do get like kind of nervous at the dark. I think anyone with like a vivid imagination can sometimes find that it turns against them in a weird way. So yeah, no, once I had company and maybe like weapons,
I think I would definitely approach it very scientifically, like with all the equipment and doing the drafts behind the curtains and stuff. Like, I could see myself focusing really hard on that and thinking about nothing else until dawn.
Yeah. Go in STEM.
Yeah. Combine the paranormal with the science. Yeah.
I have to say, even though I do go looking for these things, if I ever actually encountered a ghost or something that was genuinely spooky, I would just be out there like a shot. I would be terrified.
So all of our books have female protagonists, and they're not always the most likable. So Harriet is not a heroine in my book. So was that something intentional from when you started writing, and how did you want readers to respond to them? And what was the process of going about writing a character who's a bit more flawed? Kat, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that kind of tends to be my go-to when I write any main character, really. They always start off a little bit arseholey. Pardon my French. So, yeah, I think with Lola, though, it's developed a lot from her upbringing because she's been raised by a sort of slightly tyrannical dad who's very controlling and doesn't like her to have friends. So she's grown up, you know, without much contact with people her own age. She's just grown up surrounded by horror films and books. So, you know, she thinks that, you know, she's unfazable by all of these things. So it kind of gives her a bit of a hardened shell. I mean, underneath that, there's a lot of damage going on there. But yeah, I think once you get to know her a little bit, I think she's an interesting character, even if she's not necessarily warm and fuzzy.
I did love that the whole way through she was kind of rolling her eyes at the tropes, the horror film tropes going on. Like, yeah, of course I'm in an abandoned fairground.
But it makes it quite smart, though, sometimes, because there was one point in the book where she hears something underneath the bed and she says, oh, this is the point in any horror film where the main character should run but never does, and then she runs because she knows better.
Excellent. Deirdre, what about you? What about your female characters?
Yeah, I always start with character rather than kind of setting or plot. I kind of have to get to know them first. And I just think kind of like we're all flawed and none of us are likable all the time. Everyone has their stuff that they're dealing with, and it wouldn't feel like, maybe it's just a reflection on my own grumpy self, like, but it wouldn't feel natural to me to write a character who is like sunny and bright and perfect all of the time. And I don't think they'd be as relatable. In Perfectly Preventable Deaths, like, each of the twins are kind of flawed in a different way. Like, Catelyn is more active and more kind of like, she's very extroverted, she's very outgoing, and her thing is kind of, she can nearly forget that people are people sometimes. And Madeline is more introverted and she's more of an overthinker, and like, she can just wait for the perfect thing to do so much that she leaves it too long. So I did kind of like playing around with their different flaws and with them as kind of like not exactly, but as slightly like mirror images of each other in that way. And I found that really interesting, and it was a really I really loved getting to know them. Like, I really like those girls.
For me, it was definitely intentional that I wanted to write like a villain, like Fleabag, or like one of those characters that you can really get your teeth into, because I don't think there's enough of them that are women, and you get like redemption arcs, but backwards was kind of what I was going for. And it was so fun. It was one of the most fun writing experiences I've ever had. I think establishing her at the start before she turned into a villain was probably the most difficult part, of like when she's kind of nice and then you have to like let her like unravel. But yeah, I would definitely do it again. I really enjoyed it. And like you say, you want all your characters to feel realistic, and realistic people have flaws anyway, so it's not necessarily like something that you do because it's supernatural. It's just realistic and human life in general. So how key are the relationships your characters have with the people around them to building up this story, and how does that play into the horror element? Kat, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, Lola has some very complicated relationships in her life. I mean, the main one that she has always had is with her dad. So I said before that he is very controlling of her, and it's created quite a stifling world, essentially, that is just full of Lola and Nolan. And she is, he wants her to be, his perfect daughter, and hasn't really given her much chance to become a person of her own. But Lola's relationship with her mother is something very different. Lola's mum disappeared. She ran off when Lola was 5, so she doesn't really have very clear memories of her mother. All that she knows is what she's been told, basically, that, her mum wanted to have a life of her own, so she just sort of up and vanished one day. So going back to Harrow Lake, the town where her mum grew up and where her mum starred in this film that her dad made and where the two of them met, it's a learning experience for Lola, and I think it helped her to sort of connect with her mum and see, parts of herself reflected there, but also ways that she can break out of the mold that Nolan has created for her.
I really love that relationship with her dad as well, and how more information came through over the course of the book, and it flipped your expectations. It was so masterfully done. It was really great.
Thank you.
Deirdre, about the relationships between your characters and how that ties into the horror or the supernatural.
Yeah, I suppose with Perfectly Preventable Deaths, I wanted to explore disconnection. So they move from where they've lived all their life to this small town where they know no one. And they're together, the kind of Sheila, the mum, Maddie and Catelyn. But at the same time, they live in a castle now. So like the physical space between them is growing, and the emotional space between Maddie and Catelyn as she gets kind of entangled into an entanglement with this boy Lon. And like Maddie begins to discover her sexuality, and she begins to discover that like what she thought was a flaw is actually a talent for witchcraft. So they both have very much their own thing going on. And rather than holding each other close and kind of supporting each other through it, they drift further and further apart. And I think that's a fear that anyone who's had like a best friend as a teenager kind of has, on that threshold from kind of adolescence into adulthood. Like there's going to be a time when you're not as close to your family, where you're standing on your own 2 feet, where you're working out who you are, and who you are might not always fit with the people that are around you. So I kind of wanted to amplify and explore the horror of that and kind of the emotional impact of it as well. Because Madeline, like, she feels very adrift without her sister. She's kind of relied on her to be the kind of nearly the social crutch for like so much of her life. That like, when she has to kind of stand on her own 2 feet and go out and make friends, like she does surprise herself. which was, it was interesting to explore. And it's that kind of, because like there's the actual horror, like, I mean, there's like, you know, kind of murder and ghosts and witchcraft and blood sacrifice and all kinds of nonsense, but like there's everyday horror too. There's like going into a room where you know no one and no one smiles at you and you feel lonely, or there's, you know, kind of realizing that like you've started your period and you don't have a tampon in your bag, and like, oh my god, what are you going to do? You know what I mean? There's all these, I suppose, little horrible moments in life anyway that I wanted to link them all in together to kind of like, as I built the sense of community around the characters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree that having a character who feels isolated is a great way to get them to do terrible things, because they feel like they've got nothing to lose, and it's a great motivation. So for Harriet, that was something I was really thinking about. Like, she's not very good at making friends. She doesn't feel like she can connect with these other ghosts who all have been friends for decades and have a very tight bond, and so that really drives her to just like go completely crazy. She doesn't care about anything because she feels like she's been rejected from society anyway. So those relationships were really key in kind of understanding what is pushing her to these extremes. So, and also I have a relationship with her gran who she's desperate to get home to, and that really drives a lot of her actions as well. So you mentioned, Deirdre, that your characters just moved into a castle, and that kind of was something that reflected their relationships and that they came to move apart. How important do you think setting is for building up the suspense of a creepy book? Do you think that location or it really can drive up the feeling of horror in a story?
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of like, while I start with character, like setting is very important, and it can reflect character, it can reflect mental state. You can do all kinds of fun things with horror, you know, kind of where it's the same scene but you describe it differently depending on where you're at in your head. And like I really wanted Ballyfran to be like textured, for like the leaves under the feet to feel crunchy, for it to be very vivid and very kind of lived in. So kind of I would have read a lot of like books about nature. I would have gone on a lot of like walks around the place. Like, I mean, not that that's like very impressive research, like, you know, but I would have kind of been noticing all these small brutal details. Like I have a lot of photographs of dead animals because I started kind of noticing dead animals everywhere. So yeah, every now and then I'll get a phone memory and it's like a shrew. It's like got no heart.
That's very witchy. And Kat, I really enjoyed how you used setting as well, particularly the bedroom, like, which starts out as just a normal teenager's bedroom and then it builds and like reveals all these secrets in really unexpected ways. How did you go about using setting in Harrow Lake?
Well, setting is always pretty much the first thing that comes to me when I get a story idea. I'll usually get a sense of a place and then I'll kind of, you know, in my head be looking around seeing, you know, all these weird landmarks, like in Harrow Lake there's the bone tree where people hang their teeth so Mr. Jitters won't come and get them. There are the caves, you know, where people have died, and, you know, the land itself is basically unstable and likely to have landslides at any moment. So it all feels very precarious and sort of frozen at the same time, because there was this huge landslide that happened there in 1928. They rebuilt the town, but they haven't changed anything since then. So everything sort of seems a bit frozen in time. So I had this kind of idea in my head that, oh, this is, you know, a very, very weird place. And then I started looking at, you know, whereabouts could I set such a thing where I can have, you know, caves and hills and a lake and, you know, all the geology of it and things like that, you know, all the boring research. But yeah, so, you know, stuck a pin in a map basically and set it in Indiana. So yeah, that was how I sort of created Harrow Lake, was just really looking around, sort of seeing what scary things I could put there, and then deciding, you know, how do I populate this awful, awful place, and coming up with some terrible characters. So that was how that happened.
For me, in my writing, I've noticed that I always use kind of closed environments to build up the terror, so the characters literally can't escape. So in The Loneliest Girl in the Universe, I had a girl trapped on a spaceship. She can't get out. And then in The Quiet at the End of the World, I had them trapped underground in a caving system. And in Harriet Stoker, they're literally his house and ghosts can't leave because they kind of disintegrate. So there's lots of ghosts all living in very close quarters, and that kind of leads to things, feuds going on that would not necessarily have happened if they'd had a bit more room. And I think that helps you build up such a creepy atmosphere when you can feel confined as a reader as well, and like there's no escape and you're trapped, and that is a great way to build up suspense. But I think it's amazing that you can take a whole town or village and make such a big space for a story, still have that kind of confined feeling and feeling like you can't escape the danger. So well done to both of you on that. So I wanted to talk a bit about villains, because obviously you have lots of classic villains in horror films. So Kat, in Harrow Lake, how did you go about creating Mr. Jitters as a character?
Well, I would have to say that I took some inspiration from the Babadook, a little bit of the visuals maybe from Slender Man, and all the horror films that I loved when I was growing up and recently as well. Just sort of picking bits and pieces that I thought, made him very terrifying. I mean, he never really speaks. So all you really hear from him is the sound of chattering teeth. So sound was something that was going to be really important for the book for me. So I tried to make sure that came across, and it was like this building sense of, horror is about to, descend on Lola and everyone else in Harrow Lake. So yeah, sound was something that I had to build into his character, which was quite difficult to kind of convey on the page rather than, through some other medium. But yeah, Mr. Jitters, he represents a lot of things. I think he's quite a cool villain.
Yes.
Your trailer as well, with him like creepy on the strings.
I love that.
Brilliant. Yeah. Deirdre, did you have any thoughts about writing villains or creating a creepy character?
Yeah, and it's kind of coming to that like thing again of like kind of like scary in the real world, scary in a horror world, so for example with Lon, like there are elements of him like, kind of like grooming, like controlling behavior that are very much the signs of an abusive partner and an unequal relationship. And as like there's something darker going on with that, but I think kind of by itself that's brutal enough. Someone preying on a teenage girl and making her lose her sense of self, and to I suppose kind of equate her value with how she's seen in his eyes, that's absolutely monstrous, and I wanted to kind of like take that and push it further a little bit, and kind of and there was a bit of me that was kind of thinking, well, like, what if Twilight but for real, like, because there's like this whole rash of like, kind of, I'm 700 years old and I'm in high school, and I want to take you to prom. Long have I traveled, and I kind of like, if you're thinking it's dodgy for like a 17-year-old to be with someone in their 20s, kind of how, like multiply that by, kind of like 100, and it's, so that's kind of, I did want to play around with that. And a lot of the horror elements in the book come from things that scare me in real life, and then I just try to amplify them and make them more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I found it quite hard to write villains in Harriet Stoker because I set Harriet herself up as a villain.
Yes.
So any villains that she finds scary have to be even more scary than she is herself. Yeah. So I had to really work hard to find a way to do that and really surprise the reader. And I ended up kind of having it be an unexpected villain who reveals himself towards the end. So that was a lot of fun.
It sounds so good.
So I wanted to talk a bit about folklore and kind of how local legends and myths have made their way into your stories. Because for me, one of the things that I first started thinking about when I was writing about ghosts was like researching all the different ghost myths around the world, and cultures have different ghosts with different skills, and I tied that into my characters' backgrounds as where they came from affected what kind of ghost they were. So Deirdre, I wonder if you could talk about how Irish folklore has kind of made its way into the narrative of your story.
Obviously, like, it has been informed by Irish folklore, particularly like elements of the witchcraft. Though I did want my witchcraft to be kind of intuitive and character driven. So I kind of cherry picked, like, say if a herb does 17 things, I would pick the 2 that best suited my purposes. I love reading folklore and mythology, and there's a writer called Michael Scott who collected his 3 volumes of Irish folklore, and within it there's a character that comes up kind of repeatedly called Nan O'Hays, who is a fairy doctor. So she is the wise woman in the cottage outside the town, and people come to her with their problems, and kind of sometimes their problems are like, kind of, the fairy stole my baby, help, and sometimes the problems are like, I want this one to die so I can marry her husband, and kind of how she deals with that is very interesting. And I quite enjoy the wise woman figure and that hedged witchcraft and that healing before there was traditional medicine, and kind of the way that kind of an isolated woman could occupy a position of power and what that meant for good and ill. And that was something that really really inspired the character of Mamo, and kind of, I wanted witchcraft to have a cost. I don't want it to be, you kind of wave a wand and everything's fixed. Kind of, you pay a price and you get some of what you want and consequences. And I think kind of folklore is big on warnings and consequences.
Kat, how about you? Did you do any research into kind of real life myths and legends for Harrow Lake?
I did, and then sort of summarily dismissed what I didn't want to use. I was looking at, myths around like raw head and bloody bones, which I think originally came from Ireland as well. Where you have this monster that eats people, and he's very sort of skeletal looking, and there were others sort of in the local area around Indiana as well that I looked at. I didn't really want to take anything too wholesale and put a spin on it, because I'm already borrowing a location from the United States. I didn't really want to claim their folklore as my own. So but that gave me a lot of freedom, I think, because there is a lot of sort of folkloric type storytelling within Harrow Lake, which I got to make up from scratch, which is delightful.
I do think that like a lot of the familiar tropes that we see in horror films and books are kind of developing into these folklore tales of what we recognize in fiction ourselves, because they are so many familiar beats that we've picked up as a culture that are our generation's kind of folklore. So I think that's really interesting. So I wanted to ask some questions from the audience. So the first one is from Tanya, who asks, how important is symbolism in supernatural fiction, and which symbols have you used in your writing? Do either of you want to start with that one?
You go.
I suppose symbolism it's a really useful tool in terms of foreshadowing, in terms of creating a layered atmosphere, and kind of like showing and not telling stuff about the character's internal journey. Like, kind of like I was saying earlier, how you can go for a walk by the same tree 2 days in a row, and like, if you're really angry, it's like a stupid tree, and if you're really happy, it's like the best tree, but with perfectly preventable deaths, I suppose the recurring symbols would be kind of plants and natural materials. Leaves play a big role. Dead or mutilated animals come up time and time again, because it's a brutal world. And the mountains and the moon reoccur over and over again in different ways throughout the book. There was one edit where I had to do a search for like words and find and replace, because I was using the words loom and bloom too much, because it was either a flower or a mountain, like, you know.
Kat, what about you?
I'm trying to think how to answer this without giving away too many spoilers, but yeah, there's quite a few things in Harrow Lake. For example, the jitterbugs that Lorelei, who is Lola's mother, she collected these jitterbugs. I think I've got one here, which is why I'm looking around me. I used to collect these when I was a kid. I'll hold it up for you to see with his little waggly legs. But yeah, this idea of these little carved toys that Lorelei collected when she was growing up, and then they become quite a sinister thing to Lola when she goes back and revisits her mother's hometown and sort of realizes that, you know, everything might have looked quite shiny and nice about Lorelei, but it wasn't really. And there's, you know, quite a lot of scary stuff going on. So there are, you know, little things peppered throughout Harrow Lake that, you know, symbolically appear to be one thing, but are not.
Yeah, I tried to do something in Harriet Stoker, which I found really challenging. I had this amazing idea for it, and then actually doing it took a bit more effort, which was that I had a narrator telling the story to the reader in kind of little sections throughout the chapters, and they kind of comment on what's going on with Harriet's story, and they've been alive a very long time, and they have all these memories of other ghosts, and they use that to kind of illustrate what Harriet's journey is going to be, or what they think is going to happen, using these old stories of other ghosts. And you never find out for a long time who this narrator is or whether they can be trusted. But I really wanted to kind of reflect back on what this current action was going on through this symbolism of all the things that have been going on over the centuries for these ghosts. And it was really difficult to pull off because they were very unreliable and they were very mysterious, but hopefully it worked, and hopefully it made everything feel a bit more sinister. And like all the ghosts have been living through these same stories cyclically for many generations. So we have some other questions. So a lot of people want to know what other inspirations we have from films or from books for younger middle grade readers, any Gothic authors. So if you have any other recommendations for those kind of things, go wild.
Okay, I have one which springs to mind brilliantly two actually, for middle grade readers. The first one would be Crater Lake by Jennifer Killick. It's this story about people in year 6 who go on a camp around Crater Lake, and very quickly things take a sinister turn. And it reminded me a lot of, do you remember the film The Faculty?
Ooh.
With Josh Hartnett, and the school kind of gets taken over by aliens. It was a brilliant film anyway, but it's like a middle grade version of that. So that is, you know, really good, funny horror for middle grade readers. But also there's one by Eloise Williams called Wild, which is a very witchy book, lots of sort of supernatural things going on there, and it's just a wonderful read.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I kind of my mind's drawn a blank on like middle grade, but like scary stories to tell in the dark is really, really creepy. And if you get the one with the like older illustrations, they're just terrifying, like by themselves. There's a book I really like, it's a collection of graphic short stories by a woman called Emily Carroll called Through the Woods.
Yes, I love her. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love her so much. But I just thought that was absolutely like spooky and fantastic, and just so like, I like finished it, made about 3 different people read it so I could talk about it with them, and then because I'd lent it out, bought a second copy to have. Like, I really love that book. God, who else do I really like? Shirley Jackson is a big one for me. Margot Lanigan, who's an Australian YA writer. She has like a book called Tender Morsels that combines fairy tale and horror in a really interesting way. I like Stephen King's short stories. Kind of, if you're going kind of gothic wise, I do quite like, it's kind of between crime and gothic, but I do like Wilkie Collins. Like, I think he can do a great, like, this is not a controversial opinion, like, I think Wilkie Collins can do a fantastic setup, guys, like, you know. But yeah, there's so many, and I know I'm going to remember like loads more as soon as this is over. Like, there's so many good books out there.
Yeah, speaking of graphic novel. Oh, sorry, Lauren.
No, carry on.
I'm just looking at this book that I got yesterday, actually. I don't know if you've heard of one called Behind You by Brian Coldrick. I'll hold it up. It's a series of, I'll show you one of them. So each page has like an illustration and then just like a one sentence, almost a story prompt. And because I get so much inspiration from the visual aspect of things. I was just flicking through it yesterday and I had about 20 different story ideas just from reading this one book. And it's absolutely brilliant. And there's also, speaking of graphic novels, have you read Thornhill by Pam Smythe? That's like a mix between graphic novel and just straight up novel, but so well illustrated and so dark and creepy. That's always one that I'll recommend too.
One that I wanted to recommend was Monsters by Emerald Fennell, which is kind of, it's very Enid Blyton about two young children who go to the seaside in England for a holiday and they start investigating a murder, and it's very gruesome and creepy. And it's I would guess it's not really middle grade because it does get very dark, but it's written in the style of a middle grade and then becomes a lot more adult towards the end. So we have another question from Barend who asks, do you think there's naturally a crossover between horror and fantasy? So do you need fantastical elements to tell a horror well? And are there certain markers to look out for to determine whether a book is horror or fantasy, or do you define it, your own writing, as being both?
Wow.
It's a big one.
Yeah, I think with Harrow Lake in particular, I tend to call it psychological horror. I know some will call it thriller or horror thriller, because it depends very much on how you interpret the things that happen there. I mean, a lot of it plays out and you're not quite sure whether it's just in Lola's head or whether these things are actually happening. And a lot of those things remain ambiguous after you finish reading. So it depends really on whether you're reading these as fantastical elements or not. I like writing them, which is why they tend to show up in a lot of my books. But yeah, I don't know that you do necessarily need fantastical elements to make it horror. I'm thinking particularly to films and novels like The Hole, you know, where you have people trapped in a bunker, or even The Bunker Diaries, another YA example, where you have, you know, just humans in a very dark situation and there's no fantastical element to it. So I don't think you necessarily need it for horror, but it does always make things a bit more fun.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree with you there. I don't think it's necessary because, like, kind of, the world can be scary enough by itself and there's elements of it that you can amplify. But that said, I love stories about witches. I loved writing all of that supernatural stuff. When I define perfectly preventable deaths, I kind of think of it as a horror first and foremost rather than a fantasy, because I suppose the horrific aspects of it were to the forefront of my mind as I wrote it. But like, once you're done with the book, it kind of becomes a conversation between the story and the reader. So like, it's up to each individual person to interact with it and make up their own mind as to how they would like to define it for themselves.
I think for me, you can have fantastical or magical elements, but the horror aspect has to come from something human. Like, it's scary because it's something that happens in real life and it reflects the real world, right? And all of like these horrible things that can happen in human relationships. So I think it wouldn't feel as creepy or as terrifying if there was kind of a magic threat. But you can have magic there, encouraging it, and like Kat was saying, questioning the reader about whether this is happening in their head or whether it's really a magical threat. But at the end, the core threat has to be human, I think, is how I define it anyway. So we've probably got time for one more question. So let me have a quick look. Do you think that plot and structure is more important to consider in horror or sci-fi compared to other contemporary YA writing?
I think it definitely is important to consider. I think with most genres, you always have to give consideration to the plot overall. I mean, whether you've got the characters driving the story or the plot itself varies a bit. But I think in horror, you always want there to be a build towards a big showdown. You always want there to be, mystery to be solved in some respect, reveals along the way. You always have to consider things like that when you pace it. And I think that's something that is key to horror, is making sure that the story is paced well. So that does tend to come back to having a solid plot.
Absolutely. No, I think kind of as like my first 3 books were diary books, and my 4th book was contemporary. And I did find with Perfectly Preventable Deaths that I had to think differently about plotting and structure, because like setting, world building, and the narrative kind of arc were, I suppose, something I hadn't tried in my fiction before, obviously all of those things are there, right? But like they became much more important once I wanted to talk about a world in which magic was possible. So I like from my own personal experience, which like it may or may not be reflective of other writers, like I think it was a lot more important and a lot more difficult for me once I stepped into genre. Like I had, I suppose, a higher duty in terms of world building.
Yeah, I'm a very plot-focused writer anyway, so I always come up with a plot and twist before I come up with the characters. But I think to really scare a reader, you have to trick them into thinking they're in the world and they can't get bored or distracted. They have to really be immersed. And so that is essential to keep the pace up and to keep revealing new things and keeping them questioning what they already think they know about the world. And all of those things come down to the plot and how you're revealing information. So yeah, I think that it's one of the key parts of being good at writing horror. So before we finish, I just wanted to ask what you're working on at the minute, and is it got any supernatural elements in there?
Right, I am working on, I can't say too much about it, but it's hopefully going to be, the book that comes out next year, fingers crossed. There is a slight element of a witchy background to it. There are some nods to Harrow Lake in it at the moment. I mean, this could all be edited out, so I don't even know if it will be in the final book. And curses and family feuds and a lot of murder. I mean, there's a real strong murder mystery element to this one, which there wasn't so much in Harrow Lake. So yeah, that's something new that I'm enjoying working on in this one.
Good stuff. That sounds great. Like, here for the witchy, a Harrow Lake book, please. But yeah, I have a book coming out in October, called Savage Her Reply, which is a dark retelling of an Irish fairy tale called The Children of Lear. So it's kind of about it's about angry swans. It's about witchcraft. It's about like kind of confronting the worst thing you've ever done and how you live with it. And it's kind of like I took the kind of wicked stepmother figure in it, and she's the narrator, and it's her story. And I kind of really was thinking a lot writing about who gets a seat at the table and who gets to decide what story is the main story, what story gets told. So yeah, my publisher Little Island is running a giveaway on their Twitter at the moment if anyone would like to win a copy.
That sounds amazing. I think I was sold at Angry Swans. So the book I'm working on at the minute is about climate change, and it has got magic in, but it's more of a political kind of magic. So I don't think I can say more than that yet. But yeah, I'm adding a bit more supernatural into that as well. So thank you for everyone for coming along and listening to this, and thank you to our lovely authors and to Walker Books for arranging this panel. And I hope you look forward to all of the other events going on over the YALC weekend. If you take a look at the publisher's social media pages, there are lots of giveaways and opportunities to read proofs and samplers. Hopefully next year we'll be able to reunite in the real world for YALC. And don't forget that all of our books are available to pre-order or buy now, so have a look on your chosen bookseller retailer. So thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. You had the hardest job moderating. Thanks for the questions.
It's a lot easier having a screen where I can double it up than being on stage with a bit of paper.